Okay. Bear with us. I should be better at tech, but okay. Share. Okay, there we go.
Okay, are we good?
All good.
Okay. Um, Thank you again, everyone, for coming. We're really excited, Anastasia and I, to be doing this presentation. We're happy to have you here. We're hoping that this will be like a helpful resource for a topic that we have both seen coming up a lot in a lot of conversations that we've been having around, which is how do we support teens and tweens with ADHD? Like two very sort of challenging things, and it's sort of a perfect storm when you have everything that's going on during adolescence, and then you also have what's happening with ADHD kind of converging. Um, so just to introduce myself, my name is Jackie Cahalan. I am a licensed psychologist. My background is in child and adolescent mental health and development, and I use that. Have a private practice now that is primarily focused on supporting parents through therapy and education and consultation, coaching type stuff. Um, Anastasia, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Anastasia Polar. I'm a licensed mental health counselor. I'm also in private practice, and my practice sees ages 6 and up, so six throughout the lifespan. And we work with not only ADHD, but a multitude of issues along with co-occurring disorders, so multiple diagnoses. Um, Individuals, couples, families, we work with it all. And we're based in Nassau County in Huntington.
Okay. Okay, so off we go. So just to give you a little bit of an overview of stuff we're hoping to talk about tonight, we are want to tell you about, first of all, what is going on. So talk a little bit about developmentally and biologically, giving you an overview of both adolescence and also ADHD, because I think understanding that helps put everything else in context. We're going to talk about how every kid is unique and basically knowing one kid with ADHD means you know one kid with ADHD, but different ways that it can present. How are kids impacted in terms of things like self-esteem, peer challenges, navigating school and independence? And then we're going to circle back and talk a little more specifically about parenting and why is this so hard as parents and what are some of the common parenting challenges? um, Using these considerations to help build our toolkit and talk about approaches and strategies that you can use at home. And then we're going to try to wrap it up all up, bring all of this stuff together, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end for discussion and questions. Anastasia, anything else you want to add before we move along?
Nope, not right now. That's our overview for the day. And then obviously, questions at the end, or also you're welcome to pop them in the chat, and then we can look at those also at the end.
Okay. Okay, so let's talk about what's going on. So, the this phase of the presentation is going to be a little bit technical. Um, I'm going to try not to like get too in the weeds on it, but I think it's really helpful to talk about because for two reasons. First of all, I think the more that we understand about what is going on for kids, the more we know how to support them. We know more how to engage with them, how to intervene, what we should do in different situations. It can guide all that. The other reason that I really think it's good to talk about this stuff is that I think it really normalizes and helps us understand, and it helps give us grace and compassion, both for what we see happening with our kids and also grace and compassion for ourselves as parents when we're trying to navigate this stuff with our kids and we're trying to help them navigate some stuff that can just be really hard at times. Um, so we're going to start with adolescence and sort of focus on that for a minute, and then we're going to talk more specifically about ADHD because then we're going to think about how these two, how to integrate them in terms of our thinking and how they kind of come together. Um, So, adolescence, to start with, this is a time in development that often has a lot of challenges. And it's really a hard time for kids because they are growing and changing so much and they've got really big feelings and they don't understand. And also, it's really hard for the adults who are in their lives and looking to support them. So, what's happening here? So, first of all, you have puberty onset, which is happening earlier and earlier these days. For girls, it starts sometimes as young as 8, usually like 8 to 13. For boys, it's still younger than it was. It's a little bit later, like maybe 9 to 14. And with puberty, we're really talking about the difference between puberty and adolescence is puberty, we're really talking about what is happening biologically. And so in puberty, there's often hormonal shifts that can contribute to like intense mood swings, irritability, emotional sensitivity. So often the very first sign of puberty with kids is not anything you see physically. It's like I've heard it. The first sign of puberty is like the slam of a door. It's sort of like what is happening to my sweet child. And then in conjunction with that, so you have all these hormones sort of going all over the place. And then during adolescence, which when we're thinking of adolescence, we're thinking of something more broader in terms of a developmental transition. So we're not just thinking about what's happening biologically, we're also thinking about what is happening cognitively, socially, psychologically. But during adolescence, the brain undergoes like pretty major rewiring and reconstruction. And it's pretty cool what's happening. It's becoming more sophisticated and more efficient through processes called pruning and myelination. So pruning is where when kids are young, their brain is making millions and millions of like neural connections. And then when they get to adolescence, it's kind of use it or lose it. And the brain actually prunes away those neural connections that aren't being used. And then in myelination, what it is it's basically like those neural pathways are getting insulated so that messages can be transmitted more quickly. So the brain's becoming more sophisticated, more efficient, but it looks like a hot mess for a while it's happening. I don't know if anyone has seen the movie Inside Out 2. I love it. I highly recommend it. It's all like following a girl through her early adolescence and what's happening in her brain. And there's one scene in there where like the construction crew comes in and they're like, it's demo day. And they knock everything out. And then they're just like, okay, we're done. We'll be back in a while. And then they just leave and they just leave this kind of like open space. And I think that's so excellent in terms of a metaphor for kind of what is happening for these kids where there's just a lot of brain changes that they don't understand and that take a while to come together. Another thing that I think is really noteworthy for adolescents is that they have lower levels of baseline dopamine in their brain, which dopamine is a neurotransmitter that is associated with motivation. So they have lower baseline but bigger spikes. So this often can contribute to it looks like lethargy. It looks like really big swings in motivation where they don't want to do anything. And then all of a sudden there's something with that feels rewarding to them. And they have, and it spikes and they're like a different kid. It looks very turbulent. It can contribute to kids looking very impulsive, making a lot of like risk-taking behavior because that's all going to kick up this dopamine and that feels good. And one thing about adolescence is like this happens, but there's also ways to think about it developmentally in terms of how do we focus this appropriately. So it can be adaptive. So how do we help them take risks that are helpful to them? If you think about it, like anytime you do a new thing, like involves risk taking. So how do we sort of channel it that way and not necessarily towards some of these other behaviors that we often think about? And then just in general, I think during adolescence, during this developmental phase, individuals they're really trying to figure out who they are. They're trying to differentiate themselves. They're from their parents and their primary caregivers, and they're really trying to separate and establish their own identity. So that looks like a lot of pushback towards you, a lot of testing boundaries. It can look very argumentative because they're really trying to establish their separate self. But at the end of the day, like all of this just looks very messy. Um, okay, so that's next slide. And so then one of the things, just again, in terms of adolescence with the tween and the teen years, is that for parents, the role of parenting is really, your role is really shifting during this phase. So you're moving from one where you're really directly involved in all of the day-to-day, things in your kid's life to trying to shift into more of a consultant role where you are trying to support them in taking more control and more responsibility for their lives. And you're trying to gradually scaffold more and more independence for them so that ultimately like they can manage their own lives. Like that's ultimately the goal if they're able to. And so how do we like our kids are going through a really big transition, and then the question is like how do we also as parents like transition our role? And that's a growth process for us as well. Some. So that's basically what I wanted to say about adolescence at this moment. And now I kind of want to shift and talk a little bit about ADHD specifically and what is happening there. And then again, we're going to kind of try to combine these two things. So I know everyone is here. You're probably have some familiarity with ADHD somewhere in your life. So I'm guessing everyone here kind of has a sense of what it is, but just for the sake of us all being on the same page, I want to define it. And so I think the definition of ADHD that I want to use for our purposes is that it's a neurodevelopmental condition that typically includes difficulty regulating attention. And I think this is one misunderstanding about ADHD. A lot of times we think of it as inattention, but really, it's more about regulating attention because people who have ADHD are actually really good at attending to things that are really interesting to them and that they like. There's hyper focus where if it is something that you want to do, you can, and it feels really good. You can go into this state where you're very, very focused on something for a long time. But that toggling back and forth and being able to attend to things that don't really interest you is not always very good. And then also controlling impulses, managing activity levels. And often when we think about ADHD, we're really thinking about difficulties with executive functioning, which include things like organization, working memory, which is your ability to like take in information, remember it, and then manipulate it in your mind. So think about like doing mental math or something like that. Time management. A lot of times people with ADHD have time blindness where they just don't have a very solid sense of time, and emotional control. So emotional dysregulation is definitely a part of that. So one of the things that we know, and this is really kind of like as sort of medical technology improves, we can scan, we can learn more and more about this, but there are brain differences that are associated with ADHD. So one thing is that people who have ADHD tend to have a smaller prefrontal cortex. So that's the part of the brain here that is really responsible for all these executive functioning tasks, for complex problem solving, for being able to sit and plan, stuff like that. There's also often a more active default mode network, and the default mode network is the part of the brain that is active when we're not really doing anything. So daydreaming, when your mind just kind of tends to wander, like stuff like that. And then also, people with ADHD tend to have lower levels of dopamine, which again is that motivational neurotransmitter, which is also low in adolescence. So you sort of have this double whammy there of like very low levels of this neurotransmitter that, is the thing that motivates you to do things. And then you're like, okay, wow. Why is it so hard to like get my kid to do things? Well, they're getting it from sort of two places. So one of the things I just want to sort of emphasize here is that because kids with ADHD have neurodivergent brains, they often thrive under very different conditions and with different types of support. And so the structure and demands of many environments don't always meet their needs. And when we couple this with the developmental conditions of adolescence, it can really be very tricky to navigate. Um, so I'm going to hand it over to Anastasia, and she is going to take us through different ways this presents and how this shows up for kids.
So, as Jackie just talked about the definition of ADHD, there are three different types. And again, you might know a kid or multiple kids that fall into one of the three. But just to kind of break them down a bit, we have the hyperactive type. So that's marked by high levels of activity. You might notice restlessness, impulsivity. They may tend to fidget a bit, interrupt others, and have a difficulty waiting their turn or act without thinking. So there's that impulsivity there. Um, and the core issue is kind of behavioral inhibition um, and the self-regulation piece. Then we also have the inattentive type. So that's marked by difficulties with attention, of course, but then there's also organization, difficulty with follow through. So a lot of times you might see that in kids. An example might be like getting homework done after school tends to be a big battle for a lot of parents. And common features include distractibility, forgetfulness, losing items, trouble sustaining focus for a long period of time. And like Jackie said, they might appear daydreamy rather than the disruptive type. And then there's, of course, the combined type. So there's a significant number of both the inattentive and the hyperactive symptoms. And they experience challenges with both focus and the impulse control. And it leads to a more noticeable impairment kind of across all the different settings, school, work, if they're old enough to work at that time, and obviously, of course, relationships. So different kids have different needs. You have to meet your child where they're at and figure out what works best for you and your family. And I do want to emphasize, especially if your child is of school age and you're noticing that they're struggling, that a thorough and proper assessment for a diagnosis is super important, especially if your kids need some school supports, whether it's an IEP, a 504 plan, and things like that. And so you really are your kid's best advocate. And there's always resources, of course, to help support you if you feel like you're not quite sure what path you should be taking, or if you might have, you're noticing some symptoms, but you're not sure. It's always best to get a consultation. Okay, so ADHD impacts all aspects of functioning, really. We're going to talk about social peer and the self-esteem challenges. Navigating friendships, of course, is part of that, group work, especially in a school setting, and conflict in relationships. And then we'll talk about preparing for adolescence and independence as they get older. So many youth with ADHD, oh, there we go, social peer and self-esteem challenges. So many youth with ADHD struggle with reading and responding to social cues. So that includes things like tone of voice, facial expressions, body language, and timing of conversations. So they may unintentionally kind of come across as too much or too quiet. Um, but of course, that's not their intention. Or they'll dart between different topics in a conversation that might be unrelated to one another. And then we also often see impulsivity showing up in conversations. So this can look like interrupting, like I just said, blurting things out, talking over others, or at times kind of like swinging between topics, especially maybe even in their social interactions with peers or in a classroom setting. Um, so they might not be completely withdrawn from everything, but they're just kind of unsure how to jump in when it's appropriate. So, and another key thing is inconsistent social performance. So you might hear adults say, or maybe you've even said this at some point, they did fine yesterday. What's so different about today? Like we had a good day yesterday. Why is today so different? That's also like a hallmark of ADHD. So the skills are there, but access to them kind of fluctuates depending on factors like attention, their emotional state, and their cognitive load, especially like those after school hours or the right before school hours, getting them out the door, having a routine. Sometimes it's kind of a battle. And we'll talk more about that later. But over time, these patterns can lead to peer rejection or exclusion. So even like subtle social feedback, like being left out, ignored, or kind of corrected frequently, it can contribute to a sense of I feel different or I don't quite fit in. And obviously outside of home, school is where the kids are spending the majority of their day and their week. Um, and sometimes they do end up having like internalized negative beliefs about themselves. I'm annoying, I mess things up, no one likes me. And these thoughts can become deeply ingrained and start to shape how they approach future social interactions and also at home too. So that leads to maybe a lower self esteem developing over time if we don't kind of intervene there and help them. Um, so we just want to make sure if we're seeing a pattern that we're kind of having these discussions with our kids. And finally, many of them might experience like a heightened sensitivity to rejection. So this can look like what adults perceive as overreactions, emotional outbursts, or the opposite end of that, which is like emotional shutdown. But underneath, sometimes that can be just an intense fear of maybe being disliked, excluded, or saying like the wrong thing, as we'll often hear kids talk about. So all these experiences are interconnected, and social challenges, they don't just stay social. They directly shape their identity, their confidence, and they take that with them, of course, as they get older in school. And we talked a little bit about the social, which is friendships, but we'll talk about group work and conflict. Um, when we think about friendships for tweens, teens, adolescents with ADHD, a common pattern is that relationships can feel intense early on, but difficult to sustain over time. So they might bond quickly. They're enthusiastic, they're open and eager, so all great things, but they might struggle with kind of ongoing skills required to maintain friendship. So, like that social cues that we're talking about, consistency, reciprocity in relationships, or even repairing a friendship after a conflict. Um, so, in group settings, we often might see difficult with turn taking, sharing control in something, or the cognitive flexibility. So, maybe moving from task to task. Um, Another important piece is misinterpreting peer intent. So, many youth with ADHD are already on alert for negative feedback. Maybe they are getting it from their teachers or there's something else going on. So they may assume rejection, criticism, or unfairness, even when it's ambiguous or neutral, right? But they might tend to internalize it and take it personal. Oh, is it? Okay. We'll open the chat later. And because of that, so conflict can escalate quickly, and impulsivity plays a major role here. There's often a limited pause between feeling something and then reacting to it. So instead of taking a step back, they may respond immediately, which, as we know, can then intensify disagreements. Um, but over time, some youth begin to develop avoidance patterns. So they might withdraw from friendships, group work, social opportunities, not because they don't care, but they might be trying to protect themselves from embarrassment, rejection, or perceived failure. I've often had experiences with kids who like group projects in school tend to be a difficult time. There's just they're thinking differently maybe as opposed to their peers when it comes to something like that. And when it comes to friendship, sometimes there's also reliance on what we call like a safe friend. So there's like that one person they're consistent with, but it's can also limit their opportunities to build broader social networks. And so we want to find the balance between helping them respect that relationship and friendship that they have with that person, but also how do we expand our network here? Um, and so across friendships, group work, and conflict, we're really seeing a combination of social skills, being vulnerable, and executive functioning challenges are interacting in real time here. Okay. And the last piece we'll talk about here, preparing for adolescence and independence. So again, this is as they grow older, expectations, different expectations will be placed on them, of course, and that's a natural part of getting older. Um, but what's important to understand, while expectations go up, their executive functioning skills may still be a, a little bit of a lag behind their peers. It, you know, with the independence in areas like time management, organization, decision making, and self initiation, which all are core areas that are impacted by ADHD. So sometimes what can look like laziness or lack of motivation is often actually just a developmental skill gap for where they're at. Um, and again, to talk about the difficulty with self regulation, as we know, teens, as they get older, they tend to get more freedom. So they're expected to then learn to manage their emotions, impulses, and responsibilities with less adult oversight, which sometimes can be a difficult time for those with ADHD, being that structure and routine is something that's important. Up into a certain age, they're used to having their parents, their teachers kind of keep them on track, so to speak, and then they're given the freedom or a freedom to take on something on their own. And so you might see a difficulty there at times. And another key factor is the identity development. So that's a time when they're asking themselves, who am I? Um, for those with ADHD, especially those who have experienced like repeated correction or struggle, they may begin to internalize a negative self concept. It's like, I'm the disorganized one, I'm the problem, I can't handle things. And so if a child is in therapy, we tend to do a lot of cognitive behavioral work to work through those negative self concepts that they may or may not have. Um, and then there's also a growing gap between the intellectual ability and the functional performance. So they're fully capable cognitively, but they have a difficulty executing tasks consistently. So that could look like we're doing homework for a few days, we're doing it great, and then the next few days we're not doing it. And so it becomes inconsistent. We'll have good days and we'll have bad days, but the routine of it tends to be a harder time. Um, and as independence increases, we also want to be mindful of risk taking and decision making. So impulsivity can obviously contribute to choices made without fully considering the consequences, especially in social interactions. Um, and because of this, the goal is to not suddenly expect full independence as they get older, but gradually scaffold it. So they'll benefit from structured support that fades over time rather than being removed all at once. So that might include things like external systems for organization, clear routines and expectations, and then ongoing coaching rather than just the correction piece. So independence for teens with ADHD isn't about doing everything on their own. It's about having the right supports in place while all of those skills are still developing. And you'll see that as they get older, even in college years, this will still be something that they're working on. And we'll talk about supporting friendships, group. Oh, yeah. We'll talk about general ideas of how to build your toolkit, and then Jackie will go into a little bit more detail regarding specific parent interventions after. Um, so when we think about teens and tweens, social challenges are often less about not caring and more so as a skill gap. So we want to focus on how do I enhance their skills and help them maintain consistency with that. So that might look like teaching and modeling social thinking skills. So we want to make sure that things like perspective taking, flexible thinking, they don't always develop intuitively for kids. So you might want to have conversations with your kids asking questions like, what might your friend be thinking or feeling right now? Is there another way to look at this situation, right? And helping them, give them the ability to look at it from someone else's point of view. Practice pause and respond strategies for impulsivity. Um, a big thing here is helping them slow down the moment, breath taking, counting, using a cue word before reacting, and having that be something that they consistently use. using role play to build conflict resolution skills. So role play it's effective because it gives them the rehearsal before kind of like any real life situations, and we'll often do this in therapy with kids with certain situations. Um, Practicing common peer scenarios like disagreements, misunderstandings, even something as simple as how do I ask a teacher for help? Sometimes it's a hard time for kiddos. There might be some anxiety there that they don't want to do that, or they don't want to do it in front of their whole class. Uh, Pre-plan for group work. So as we've talked about, it can be especially challenging. So we want to make sure clear roles, expectations, checklists, or something that's concrete can be used. Coaching inter Coach interpretation of peer intent. So what else could be true? We want to gently ask them what else could be true, and this helps reduce emotional reactivity and builds a more balanced thinking over time. And we talked about kind of having the safe friend they rely on, but we do want to encourage multiple friendships. Um, at the same time, we're helping them build flexibility, encouraging other connections with a range of peers, and this supports resilience when social dynamics shift. Maybe some of you are parents who have older kids or kids that are different ages, and you might see friend groups change, and now your child has to navigate that, and that can be tricky for them. Reinforcing effort, not just the outcomes, and this is something that I talk about all the time. Um, Social success doesn't always happen immediately. So if a child initiates a conversation, tries to stay calm during a disagreement, or attempts to repair, they had a fight with a friend, and they attempt to repair that dynamic, regardless of the outcome, reinforcing the effort that they made to approach that situation on their own. And then, of course, collaborating with teachers. Um, as parents, this is something huge, especially if you're part of a big district. I know some of our districts out here on Long Island, depending where you are, um, dynamics are very different. Um, but that's something that I can't emphasize enough.
Okay. Um, so let's circle around now, and focus a little bit more on what exactly this means for parents and like why is this so hard and what are some of the common parenting challenges that we see. And I think just the core struggle a lot of times is how do we hold both pieces of both trying to give kids more independence while also supporting and advocating for their unique needs? Like, how do we give them what they need while also acknowledging that they need to pull away and establish their own identity? And how do we help structure their environment so that they can operate both safely and independently? It's sort of like contradictory. Like, how do you support them and how do you give them the space to like pull away and establish their own identity? And I'm going to go through like some specific things in terms of a toolkit, but I think two really general considerations that I think can be really helpful for this is the idea of like how do you give your kids support while pulling yourself out of it? And two things that I think can be really helpful with that is one, building really good consistent systems and routines, so stuff that just becomes automatic and is just kind of the way things are and the way things are structured so that it has the support built in. And then also like not trying to do all of this yourself and building a team of people that you trust and really outsourcing what you can so that you can sort of establish the support and also move yourself out of the middle of it because they don't want you there, right? They don't want you there. And that is developmentally appropriate. Like that is healthy in what we want to see, and you want to make sure that they have the support they need. So those are a couple general considerations. And now let's talk about like how do you build your toolkit? And the first thing I want to say here is that like we've been talking about how every kid is different and every family is different. And so some of these might work for your kid and your family and some don't, and that is fine. Really, ultimately, there is very little in parenting that is like right or wrong. It really ultimately is like what works best for you, what is consistent with your values and your priorities and your goals and trying to figure it out from there. So with everything, take what works and sort of disregard the rest. And some of these, you probably find that you are already trying to do. Um, so one of the big things is really structure the environment in ways that work for your child and work for your family. So wherever possible, have things be interest driven and activities and assignments for your kids. What do they enjoy doing? Because as we talked about earlier, um, when kids are able to choose things and have it be things they're interested in, they're much more likely to be able to be very engaged in that. And it's going to be so much harder when it is just something they do not care about, right? That is where you're going to struggle a lot more. So where can you inject that? Um, Also, like I mentioned before, like having lots of consistent routines and structure as much as you can. When you can make it automatic, that's going to reduce the cognitive load for everybody. You don't have to really think about it. It also reduces a lot of friction and conflict between you and your child because you're not negotiating everything. Like you're hopefully not having the same day-to-day complaint because it just is the way it is. And you can, like a lot of times I'll say like slap, figure out your list, your morning routine, whatever, slap it on the fridge or wherever it is to look at it. And then when your kid's not doing something, instead of getting in the middle and like getting in this big power struggle about what they're supposed to be doing, it's more like, well, what does the list say? What does the list say? And one of the things we'll talk about more in a minute is the more that you can engage your kids in collaboratively developing this stuff with you, the better. And that's going to reduce friction more because they're going to have more buy-in because they helped create this. They helped solve this problem. You're on the same team. It's you and your child against like the morning routine instead of like you and your child arguing over the morning routine. Another thing I think is really important to think about through all this is to really, when you don't know what to do, try to figure out ways to prioritize and protect your relationship with your child. That means really picking your battles. Like you don't have to argue over every little thing. Some things you can just let go. You can figure out where you set your guardrails. A lot of times, like definitely around things that involve safety and judgment, but other things like you don't necessarily have to nitpick. So sort of thinking about that. Also, kids with ADHD often need extra support, but they don't want to hear it from you. They don't want to hear it from their parents. So how can you outsource and bring other people in, like either tutors or coaches or other relatives or other trusted adults who can be sort of giving your kids this guidance and setting these expectations. So then again, it's not you need to do your homework, but like, well, what did your teacher say? What did your teacher say they expect you to do? And what is the consequence going to be? So what are you going to do there? So you're helping them solve the problem and think about what the consequences might be without you having to necessarily like set them yourself so that it's more in the structure. And that's going to save your relationship. And that is really parenting for the long term and thinking about a long-term trajectory versus like, what am I trying to do right in this moment? And that is going to help you. Another really big thing I think is just trying to encourage self-advocacy in your kids. So have a lot of conversations about this stuff. This is not a one big what is ADHD conversation. This is something that you want to establish a foundation that you and your kid can come back to whenever you need to about like helping them understand what are their needs, what conditions like are really helpful for them so that they can begin to learn to advocate for themselves. And that is going to help them build that independence that we're really trying to support.
Jackie, if I can
Okay.
just jump in here for
Yeah.
a quick moment. The self-advocacy piece, I've often come across a lot of kids and teenagers too who they are unsure of like the language to even use on like how do I advocate for myself, whether it's a teacher with whatever the situation is. And so I think having these discussions at home is super important to be able to, because again, as we talked about, every family is different, but what language do you want to teach your kids how to use to then they can take that on their own as they're trying to gain that independence so they can do this for themselves.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. And I think that's great. And I think that's part of one of the things I mentioned in the beginning about as when your kids are becoming more adolescent and your role as a parent is shifting from one where you would directly go and talk to the teacher, maybe, to one where, yes, you have that conversation at home. Like, well, what could you say? Like, what are you going to do tomorrow? When are you going to go talk to your teacher? Like, do you want to practice it? And giving them the language and really giving them those tools. So, yeah, 100% I agree. Okay. Um, so in terms of thinking about other approaches and strategies to be thinking about, one is that using concrete motivational tools can be really helpful for kids with ADHD. There's like some controversy right now about whether or not stuff like sticker charts and chore charts and sort of these external motivation motivators are stuff that we should be using for kids. And I don't agree with that. I think especially kids with ADHD where their dopamine is lower, you need like they need tangible rewards sometimes or they're not going to do it, right? Like that and let's all of us adults, everybody in their life sometimes has things that they are not intrinsically motivated to do and they just have to do. So I am a big proponent of like if you need to do a sticker chart, if you need to add some kind of external incentive, like that's fine. Just do it. You want it to be clear and specific so that kids know exactly what's expected of them. And not only rewards, but when there is a problem, you want the environment or there to be clear, consistent, and immediate consequences, because that is what they're going to respond to more. Again, with, you know, in terms of how their executive functioning often works, consequences like, oh, if you don't study for this test, like you're gonna like not get into a good a college of your choice or whatever down the road or whatever it is, like that is meaningless. That's meaningless. It needs to be something that is going to happen right away. And a lot of times, like if there's able to be natural consequences where they make a mistake and the environment provides those consequences, that is ideal. But if you have to like add it yourself, like I think that is fine. Like again, you're trying to it's just going to be more consistent with how their brain works and how they're going to learn and what they're going to respond to. Also, I think simplifying the environment wherever you can. So if where they're studying or doing their homework or whatever, clear out a lot of the extraneous stimulation so that there are not a million things distracting them. Just simplify things. And then also think about your environment and how you function and how your kid functions and create systems that work with everybody's needs. So for an example of that is if there is like a place where you always need a pen and your kid is always wandering off with that pen, tie a pen to a string and like attach it to the wall or something so that there is just a pen there when people need it. Or even like in terms of time blindness, putting clocks everywhere. So just little things like that, like putting, maybe not getting super nitpicky about things being perfectly organized, but maybe just having bins for general organization where you can easily like throw stuff in. Like whatever works for you, try to think functionally and that is fine. Like just do it. Um, Another thing to think about is really how are you engaging with your kids when there is something that you need to communicate um, to them. So just like gentle touch, like put your hand on their shoulder to get their attention. Um, Not over explaining things, using less words, like simplifying what it is that you need to communicate them. Um, and just being really simple about it. Breaking things into smaller pieces. A lot of times tasks can get very overwhelming and just chunking it down into little things and taking it one piece at a time. One piece and then the next piece and then the next piece and then the next piece. And then another thing that can be really helpful for kids in terms of how you engage is if they need support to sit down and focus on their homework. I feel like one of the things that we're hearing more and more about a lot lately is just this idea of body doubling. And body doubling, all that means is that you are like a presence there. You don't need to be actively engaged sometimes to help them be able to be more focused on something. Sometimes just sitting there reading a book or doing your own thing and sort of like doing your work next to their work can really help give them something to model off of, and it can be really helpful. And then I just want to talk quickly about medication. People have very different feelings about medication. I think of it as like one tool in the toolkit. It is a tool that not everybody uses, but some people find it really, really very helpful. And there is also a growing body of research that shows like one of the things with adolescents and ADHD is that kids can often, because they are impulsive, um, can engage in like really high risk behaviors, and also can be more at risk for things like addiction because addiction works on the dopamine circuitry. And there is research showing that medication might mitigate some of those risks for them. So it is something to consider. It is definitely something to talk to a trained provider about. Again, some kids and families are able to operate just fine without it, and other people feel like it is really very essential to everybody's well-being. So, considering just what is best for your child. Okay. And then just a couple more very general things to consider. Um, One is prioritizing sleep, physical activity, and nutrition. Sleep is so important, and I feel like it is something that is really devalued in our culture. Like we give a lot of like, oh, I only got 4 hours of sleep last night. There's almost a thing of pride. Kids who are in adolescence and kids who have ADHD, like sleep is the glue that holds everything else together. It makes us better regulated. It helps us think more clearly. It helps us focus better, all of the things. So, you know, th- kids this age really should be having the opportunity to sleep like 8 to 10 hours a day. But making that, and if your kid doesn't need that much sleep, that's different. But giving them the opportunity and trying to structure the schedule so they have the opportunity for that, I think is important. Same thing with physical activity. Like when kids have, I don't like that schools have so little opportunity for kids to move around all day because I think when kids have the opportunity to move their body and to exercise, it can really help to regulate and focus and do a lot of good things that then translates to when they have to be sitting still or being more focused on other things. And also just good nutrition, and eating things that are going to be good for the body. Like all of this stuff can be very helpful. Um, Another thing that I mentioned before is how do we make this collaborative, when you're trying to figure things out with your kids, engaging them in the process around decision making. It increases their buy-in, it increases their sense of autonomy. You're trying to build independence. And so anytime you can say, and if something is frustrating to you and you're identifying a problem, like 100%, it is probably really frustrating and hard for your kids too. So there's a lot of space there to align with. Like, oh, this doesn't seem to be going very well for you. Like, what are we going to do about this? Or, and really trying to see like kids. I don't know that we always give them enough credit for like really having good ideas and knowing what might work best for them. And whenever you can open up a conversation, I think that can be really helpful in terms of like trying something. And even if it's something you think won't work, if it's safe and seems like it might work, like give it a try and then you can reevaluate and you can adjust and adapt as you need to. This is a constant calibration. You're allowed to like when things are just not working at any point, like you're allowed to just decide that they're not working and talk to your kids and say like I feel like we need to change something about this. So you're allowed to adapt. Don't just think that things have to be like this is what we need to do and we're fixed and we're gonna stay the course no matter what. Um, and then I think another really important thing to consider is just like how do you have lots and lots of compassion and grace for everybody? This is all like so messy and it's so hard. And I think that if we just always approach it with the assumption that everyone involved is trying their best, it's going to get you a lot further than assuming that people involved are purposely trying to like undermine something or cause a problem or whatever. And you know what? Like we all have moments where things get messed up or we have a bad day or we show up not as our best selves, and that is normal in relationships. That is to be expected. If you are trying to focus on your relationship most of the time and trying to show up and be generally attuned to your kids most of the time, because that really is the goal, then there is plenty of opportunity to say, I really screwed up. That was not my best day. Can we have a redo, to find a way to repair that, to circle back and say like that wasn't my best self, and to say, can we try this again, and to move forward. And not only is that like normal, because it's way too much pressure to try to never screw this stuff up, but also what your kids learn from that, what you're modeling for them, is that like no one is expected to be perfect, and we all get redos. We can all circle back and try again, and we can fix our mistakes and move forward from there. So, um, now just bringing it all together. We've thrown a lot of information at you. But just to sort of lay out some kind of main takeaways or general things to think about as you consider this presentation. Um, First of all, is just this is a time of development that is often filled with challenges for kids and parents. That's normal. Understanding what's going on for your kids can help you figure out how to best support them. Um, and there's no right or wrong way to do this. Every kid is unique, every family is unique. Just do your best to try to understand your kid, to understand all of the things that might be going on in their lives, and trying to meet them where they're at in a way that really works for you. Um, Parenting for the long term, so not just thinking about what is happening in this moment, but thinking more about what is going to be sustainable for you and your family, and what are the things that you're ultimately trying to instill that you want them to learn and take with them into the future. Being really, really gentle with yourself, with your child. Mistakes happen. We all do our best. And when in doubt, taking care of yourself, coming back to the relationship, and looking for ways to repair and adapt as needed. And then Anastasia, I think you had a couple things you wanted to
Yeah, so
add.
the big thing that I wanted to, we've talked about advocating for your children, keeping up with school personnel, if you feel like they're in need of like additional support. Um, I'm sure Jackie can attest to this. You might come across kids, your kid has a 504 IEP, or there's some plan that's been in place and school's not following said plan, or there's issues there. And so that's really where it's time for you to step in and talk to the school. But the other thing that I wanted to mention is to practice self-compassion, which we all need to do. This evening we've talked a lot about emotional regulation for kiddos with ADHD, and as parents giving them the tools and skills to kind of help them utilize them, and then obviously take them as they get older. But also as parents, like, it also requires you to tap into your own emotional regulation skills, because this is a daily practice that you do with your kids, and so it can be difficult. So just be kind to yourself.
100%. So, here, this slide is just some recommended resources that Anastasia and I pulled together. There's a bunch of websites that have like a ton of articles and resources and stuff that could be really, really helpful. And then I know I put a couple books on here. That there's a lot of books out there, but there's one by Penn Holderness and his wife. I don't know. They do a lot of like social media little spoofs and stuff. And he has ADHD, and he wrote a book called ADHD is Awesome. And I really like it because it is just very relatable, and it is just for like it's not too clinical, and he writes it from the perspective of like just a regular person who an adult who lives with ADHD, and what it's like for him, where it's helpful, where it gets a little sticky sometimes. Um, and then uh, Dan Siegel has a book called Brainstorm, which really has a lot of good information on the power and the purpose of the teenage brain. Oh, and there's a comment in here, Jen, that you really love Poppy and the overactive amygdala for kids. So that's a good one too. I don't know that one. I'll have to check it out. But these are some things that you can take a look at. Um,
Yeah, Chat is I believe they're a nonprofit. They have different I think they call them chapters. We do actually have two chapters here on Long Island. So you can go on the website and put in your location. I think there's one in Northport, and I forget where the other one is, but they do a lot of parent education, workshops. I believe there's a few support groups, and they're all free of charge because they are a nonprofit. So, which is a great thing to have access to that. And I'll stop
okay.
sharing.
Any
Any
questions?
questions?
I know one thing we didn't really highlight that I felt like I meant to and I wanted to mention is like how much tremendous creativity often comes with ADHD. And I don't think we
Yeah.
talk a lot about that and how like kids with ADHD or anyone with ADHD, like you think about it like a floodlight versus a spotlight where, you know, they're taking in so much information from everywhere. And I think that often enables them to pull things together in different and unique and really creative ways. And there's so much richness there, whereas other people who are more focused,